Hi, I'm Rob King at Columbia University at the School of the Arts, the Film Division, and this is a panel on The Wire and serial narrative. I suppose we might say that we live in an era where seriality as a media trope has achieved remarkable visibility thanks to innovations in HBO programming, in watching DVD box sets, in streaming, binging, and so on and so forth. And The Wire has emerged as a significant text in this regard, and seriality as a significant theme of contemporary scholarship on media narratives. We're fortunate really to have an absolute dream team of media scholars in this respect, and I will introduce them in the order that they'll be presenting today. We're going to be starting with Jason Mittell, who is a professor of film and media culture and American studies at Middlebury College. He's the author of such works as Genre and Television, from cop shows to cartoons in American culture, television and American culture, and perhaps most significantly with a view to The Wire, his recent book, Complex Television, The Poetics of Contemporary Television Storytelling, and he will be presenting on The Wire as Complex TV. Following Jason Mittell, we will have Professor Linda Williams on the topic of serial, television, and melodrama. Linda Williams is a professor of film and media and rhetoric at UC Berkeley, where she teaches courses on melodrama, sexual imagery and serial television. And I think your decision to start teaching The Wire was in fact kind of widely covered in the news media when that happened a few years ago, right?
Yeah, as if it was transgressive in some way.
Okay, well, she's the author of Hardcore, Power, Pleasure, and the Frenzy of the Visible, Playing the Race Card, a term that's already come up today, Melodramas of Black and White, from Uncle Tom to O.J. Simpson, Screening Sex, and recently On the Wire from 2014. And finally, we will have Frank Kelleter presenting on the topic of finding oneself on television, The Wire, and some sequels. Frank Kelleter is chair of the Department of Culture and Einstein Professor of North American Cultural History at the JFK Institute at the Freie Universität in Berlin. His main fields of interest include the American colonial and Enlightenment periods, theories of American modernity, and American media and popular culture since the 19th century. He is extraordinarily prolific, so I'll list only some of his more recent books, which include Serial Agencies, The Wire and Its Readers, an edited volume of media and serial narrative. And when I last met him in the fall of last year, he was completing a book which unfortunately becomes timely on David Bowie. So I will ask Jason Mittell to get things going. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, especially on a panel with Linda and Frank, who are the two scholars whose writings on The Wire have most influenced my own thinking, and all of our projects are sort of generating at similar times, and we were in conversation, so I feel like it's a dialogue, and it's great to actually have the three of us here enacting that dialogue. So as Rob said, I have a recent book that came out about a year ago called Complex TV. And in this book, I analyze the textual phenomenon of storytelling on television in the past 15 to 20 years or so in relationship to shifts in the industry, technology, and viewer practices. And I just want to give you a really brief overview of the concepts that I talk about in the book, and then why almost all of them do not apply to The Wire. One of the main arguments is that this era of complex TV is really exemplified by a blend of episodic and serial norms, where sort of the episodic model of individual standalone episodes is very much in decline. At the same time, the paradigm of seriality of daytime soap operas is also in decline. And what we have in the middle is something that is a hybrid, and that typifies a lot of primetime television, especially what we often call prestige television. Many of these programs use very non-conventional storytelling techniques. So using things like varying of temporality and multiple perspectives of narration, the blur between fantasy and reality, the use of explicit direct address narration, embodying long-term enigmas as a plot engine. And many of these strategies are used very reflexively. There's a self-conscious nod to explicit storytelling mechanics, where an individual program will have its own intrinsic norms and repeat them serially across the entire series. And this gives rise to what I've termed the operational aesthetic, borrowing from Neil Harris and his account of Barnum. And this is the pleasure of the storytelling process, not just the product. So we watch many of these programs as narrative machines to be admired. And storytelling itself becomes a spectacle and what I call the narrative special effect. And this in turn leads to a mode of viewer engagement that I've called forensic fandom, where viewers function as amateur narratologists attempting to decode and crack the way in which these stories play out, both their enigmas within the story and their strategies at the level of narrative discourse. And this is very much tied to shifts in technology, with online fan culture taking up these mantles of trying to solve programs in this way. And these traits fit very well with many of the programs that I discuss in the book, such as Lost, Breaking Bad, Battlestar Galactica, The Sopranos. There are a lot of examples, as well as comedies like Arrested Development and Curb Your Enthusiasm. But what of The Wire? Because The Wire, I think, is quite different from most of these facets, and we can kind of go through these from the bottom up and see how forensic fandom, not really in play in The Wire. Fans did not spend a lot of time trying to decode the case. They were riding alongside both the cops and the criminals in various seasons in this way, not trying to predict or uncover any sort of mysteries. In fact, The Wire notoriously avoids mystery altogether. It is not highly reflexive. It is not really focused on the storytelling itself as a mode of engagement, although there's an exception that I'll talk about later in my presentation. But the operational aesthetic is a very minor dimension of The Wire. Its use of norms is not particularly reflexive. In fact, I'd say it attempts to efface its own storytelling as much as possible. It avoids non-conventional storytelling techniques such as multiple perspectives and the sort of non-realist mechanisms that a lot of other programs do. In fact, if you ask David Simon to this day if he has anything he would change about The Wire, he will say, that damn flashback in the first episode. He hates that flashback where D'Angelo sees the victim in the pit, the witness from the trial, that was forced upon him by HBO and in the pilot, and he says that's the worst thing in the entire series, that one moment. So the one moment of less conventional, straightforward storytelling is the one he regrets. And then finally, the blend of episodic and serial norms. I mean, if anything, The Wire is one of the most overtly serialized programs insofar as continuity trumps episodic unity. It's very difficult to say, oh, the episode of The Wire where X happens, you can focus on the moment, but you can't point to the episode as a whole. Very rarely. There is certainly some thematic unity to individual episodes, but there's really the construction of, they were building seasons, not episodes, for the most part. Okay. But there are some key ways that The Wire does function in my analysis of complex TV, and there are three of them that I want to outline in the rest of my talk here. So the first crucial role of The Wire in complex TV is the role of the box set as a mode of narrative consumption, or what I term in the book serial boxes. The vast majority of The Wire's viewers consume the series via box set or online streaming via HBO Go. And a few people have mentioned this already, but I'm just curious, show of hands, how many of you did actually watch it from the first season onward as it aired? You know, a smattering here, right? You know, it's not the normal mode of consumption. It's really tied to this compressed viewing via seeing television as a boxed object. And this is indicative of a larger cultural shift of television from the scheduled weekly release toward a bound object to be treated as a whole and displayed upon a shelf. And I think this is really important, the idea that you put a television series on your shelf is quite novel. And for those of us who, you know, grew up as television consumers in a previous era, we would never have done that, right? So the fact that now we do this and proudly display the Wire box set and The Sopranos and the like is a really important shift, both in viewer practice and in cultural legitimation of the medium. And the series narratively lends itself to this mode of narrative consumption, and David Simon and many critics have long used the metaphor of the televisual novel to describe it, and I actually am very critical of that term because I think it avoids really engagement of television itself as an aesthetic form, which is what I do in the book. But the idea that it does become a bound object the same way that a Dickens novel was once serialized and now is bound, and it's almost impossible to experience as a serial text anymore, is very much wrapped up in our understanding of The Wire. So The Wire represents this paradigm of television designed ideally to consume over a compressed time period, over days, rather than serialized over weeks and years, the way that it was originally presented. And now this is a common occurrence with the rise of so-called binge viewing via Netflix, Amazon, and the like. And I think The Wire really helped establish that precedent. I've certainly heard from television writers that they look at The Wire as an example of how to do a bingeable show well. That there is this sense that it has a certain unity and momentum, at least within an individual season. So I think the combination of the legitimacy as a bound object and this compelling narrative experience of watching a season in compressed time is one of the most important legacies, and The Wire serves as a landmark in that regard. So another one of the ways I discuss The Wire in the book is its relationship to different forms of complexity that go just beyond narrative and serial form. So in the book, I have an elaborate comparison between two programs, The Wire and Breaking Bad, to consider how they function as different vectors of complexity, what I call centrifugal versus centripetal complexity. So just to explain this a little bit, The Wire embraces centrifugal complexity where the ongoing narrative always pushes outward, spreading characters and relationships across an expanding story world. On a centrifugal program, there is no single narrative center, as the action traces what happens between characters and institutions as they spread outward. And it's not just that these series expand in quantity of characters and settings, but that its richness and complexity is found in the web of interconnectivity forged across the social system, rather in the depth of any one individual's role in the narrative or psychological layers. So for instance, the fourth season's resolution is predicated on how the fate of kids like Randy and Naaman are not determined by their own mettle or talents or psychology, but by the coincidental actions undertaken by agents of the interconnected institutions of the school system, the police, drug gangs, and city government. Now, based on conventional narrative logics, Randy's entrepreneurial spirit and warmth would allow him to rise above his circumstances, while Naaman's bitterness and sense of entitlement should doom him to replicating his father's role on the corners. But on The Wire, character traits and choices are frequently determined by the complex institutional networks portrayed through the program's vast serial expanses. And character agency is rarely able to make a difference in broader institutional systems. Characters at best can hope to escape their fates by happy accident, combined with a willingness to make personal sacrifice. Systemic logic trumps character actions or motivations. And I say this is part of this idea of the centrifugal complexity, where it's the system over the individual that is always the sort of narrative engine. A great quote on this is Snoop, who quotes Clint Eastwood in Unforgiven, when she answers the question to Michael what he did to deserve his fate. She justifies this unjustifiable murder by saying, deserve's got nothing to do with it. And I think that's the logic, that it's away from character psychology. Contrast that with Breaking Bad, which I use in the book, where deserve's got everything to do with it. If The Wire is all about broad systemic vastness, Breaking Bad exemplifies a model of dense television, embracing centripetal complexity where narrative movement pulls actions and characters inward toward a gravitational psychological center, establishing a thickness of backstory and character depth that always drives the action. This effect is to create a story world with unmatched depth of characterization, layers of backstory, and psychological complexity, building upon viewer experiences and memories over its numerous seasons. And the sense that in that show, if you know it, everything is always pulling inward toward what Walt is thinking and experiencing. And Jesse as another sort of gravitational pull as well. Walt's choices may be circumscribed somewhat by his context, but they always produce multiple options with divergent outcomes. So he always has choice and agency, and he's consistently making the wrong choices. But it's all, we're in his head as he does it, very differently than what we see on The Wire. Additionally, the series frequently revisits moments from the narrative past to fill in gaps in character histories or relationships, whether through flashbacks or returning to narrative consequences of events. On Breaking Bad, there's always a sense that a marginal past event might get pulled back to the narrative center and impact Walt's psychology and fate. Whereas on The Wire, such connections may reemerge, but only through the vast, sprawling network of characters and institutions. It's usually about new connections rather than new internal ramifications. So a comparison between two similar climactic moments in these two series highlight the dual approaches to complexity. I'm not going to detail the moment in Breaking Bad for the sake of time, but it's when Walt watches Jane die toward the end of season 2, and we watch him silently experience this moment, and we fill in his psychology with everything we know and experience. So everything is, again, pulling into what is going on in his head. Whereas at the end of The Wire's first season, we also witness the death of a young character at others' hands, as Bodie and Pooch shoot Wallace per Stringer Bell's orders. Now, there's certainly character resonance between these three friends, and we recognize that there's no point of, this is a point of no return for Bodie and Pooch's commitment to the game. But it's clear that they have no choices, really. Their only source of livelihood is as part of the drug crew, and the game demands that they demonstrate their loyalty or end up like Wallace themselves. Ultimately, the emotional impact of this scene underlies the social conditions and institutional logics that led inevitably to this moment, not complex internal moral calculations or psychological developments. Pooch and Bodie undertake an all too common action dictated by their institutional marginalization, while Walt's act is fully unique and individualistic, not standing in for larger social forces. So I think this is an example of these two very different modes of complexity and storytelling that I think are, both very powerful in very different ways and have differing effects. Okay, the final way I want to relate The Wire to the discussions of complex TV concerns its often maligned final season. Now, I want to go on record with an unpopular proclamation, which is that season 5 is my favorite season of The Wire. And I want to clarify what I mean by favorite. I'm not saying it is the best, that's season 3. I'm not saying it's the most powerful, that's season 4, but it's my personal favorite. It's the one that speaks to me and I feel a sort of irrational allegiance to in this way. And I met David Simon last fall and I told him this and he said that I am the only person who has ever told him this. So I will own that. Now, in a large part, it's because it speaks to my broader analytical concerns surrounding serial television endings. And hopefully the connections that I'm going to draw will deepen your appreciation of that final season. So many complex television series turn toward issues of metafiction in their final seasons. Both thematically and structurally, they consider issues of storytelling itself as a way to approach their own conclusions. This is true for The Sopranos, Lost, and 6 Feet Under, as well as comedies like Seinfeld and Arrested Development. And I find the way that The Wire embraces its own version of metafiction particularly compelling. The Wire throughout functions as a form of fictionalized journalism to shine a light on urban conditions that are rarely explored in any medium. And Linda's work on this in her book is fabulous. Now, the 5th season is when that function becomes most central and overt, with the 2 major intertwined plot lines focusing on the theme of storytelling and the lines between fiction and truth. The lying journalist Scott Templeton and Jimmy McNulty's fake serial killer. For many critics of that final season, this focus on unrealistic storylines and unlikely scenarios seemed like a distraction from the Wire's tradition of realist storytelling and social engagement. But through the lens of metafiction, these plot lines reinforce the series' function as a site of social realism and critique. For McNulty, the big lie of the serial killer is a necessary fiction to gain attention and resources needed to address the truth of drug boss Barlow Stanfield's orchestrated killing spree. And we watch as he experiments with various narrative strategies to hook the bosses on his whopper of a tale. For the newsroom storyline, Templeton's escalating lies reveal the commercial and editorial pressures that cause journalism to miss the real news and focus on either simplistic or sensational stories, regardless of their social importance or actual truth value. Together, the season asks us to think about the boundary between truth and fiction, and more centrally, questions how we know what we know. Clearly, if we only relied on the Baltimore Sun, we would not know the stories of how drug dealers organize distribution and exert political influence, how dock workers fight to sustain itself in the wake of deindustrialization, how a rigged system against urban kids creates casualties out of the most promising students, or how corruption at City Hall jukes the stats for political gain. It is only through the fiction of The Wire that these true stories, or at least stories grounded in larger truths, if not actually true, of Baltimore are told, and we watch the newspaper miss the truths that matter. So season 5 asks us to reflect on the process of storytelling and our own culpability in privileging the big lie. And I want to just show a clip from the season's most meta moment from the episode Unconfirmed Reports, as the newspaper editors debate how best to tell the story of the city's failing schools.
The word I'm thinking about is Dickensian. We want to depict the Dickensian lives of city children and then show clearly and concisely where the school system has failed them.
Not to defend the school system, but a lot of things have failed those kids. They're marginalized long before they walk into class.
You want to look at who these kids really are, you got to look at the parenting or lack of it in the city. The drug culture, the economics of these neighborhoods.
And yet the schools are something that we can't address.
Yeah, sure, we beat up on city schools. Lord knows they deserve to be beat on every once in a while. But then we're just as irrelevant to these kids as the schools are. I mean, it's like you're up on a corner of a roof and you're showing some people how a couple of shingles came loose, and meanwhile, a hurricane wrecked the rest of the damn house.
You don't need a lot of context to examine what goes on in one classroom.
Oh, really? I think you need a lot of context to seriously examine anything.
No. I think Scott is on the right track. We need to limit the scope, not get bogged down in details.
To do what? To address the problem or to win a prize? I mean, what are we doing here?
Look, Gus, I know the problems. My wife volunteers in a city school. But what I want to look at is the tangible, where the problem and solution can be measured clearly.
There's more impediments to learning than a lack of materials or a dysfunctional bureaucracy.
But who's going to read that? What is this series about in a sentence? What's the budget line?
Johnny can't write because Johnny doesn't have a fucking pencil.
Augustus, I'm not as simple-minded as you might think. Now, what do you want, an educational project or a litany of excuses? I don't want some amorphous series detailing society's ills. If you leave everything in, soon you've got nothing. I think the schools are ripe for exploration, and I think Scott might be the man to lead the charge.
Okay, so the meta-commentary here rings out. Gus's line, quote, "I think you need a lot of context to seriously examine anything," could serve as a mission statement for The Wire itself. While Whiting's warnings against an amorphous series detailing society's ills functions as a succinct negative gloss on what some skeptics might say the series The Wire itself amounts to. And this meta-commentary extends through a lot of plot lines. McNulty's serial killer, certainly in contrasting other forms of police television. Meanwhile, Templeton winning awards, including the award named for this building we're in right now, I think is serves as a stand-in for The Wire's own lack of Emmys and award recognition, where more conventional fictions are rewarded. The way in which The Sun misses the really important stories of Proposition Joe and Omar Little's deaths. And of course, Bubbles himself is framed by the rare act of quality journalism in the form of the long-form narrative feature, but we only appreciate his understated triumph in climbing his sister's stairs through the lens of fictional drama. So I'm going to skip forward here to conclude here and say that the finale itself has numerous moments where characters are forced to reckon with their own narrative arcs and the stories that people tell about them. So Bubbles learns to accept that newspaper profile, allowing it to be published as an act of humility and acceptance on his road to recovery. Daniels sacrifices his police career due to his unwillingness to buy into the fabrications of the stat game and drawing the lives of what stories he's willing to tell. Marlowe tries the new character of legitimate businessman, but falls back to his old stories on the corner. McNulty's Wake retells his own story as natural police. And then the cyclical storytelling where you get a series of characters taking up the mantles of all the other characters in that final episode. So all these ways, it never overtly acknowledges its own storytelling mechanics, but The Wire is clearly self-consciously concluding and working to offer closure that thematically resonates with its own mediations on storytelling journalism and using fiction to portray truths. So I want to conclude with that tension between The Wire as a journalistic expose of the social ills of 21st century America and as a work of television storytelling. And as these 2 days of conversations here play out around the series, we will hear from many experts discussing what the series can teach us about contemporary society. But we can never lose sight of what the final season teaches us about itself, how The Wire tells its stories as a work of complex television fiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. It is a truth universally acknowledged that The Wire's the best of television serials. TV critics, journalists, literary scholars, even the President of the United States have proclaimed it the best ever. Journalist Joe Klein proclaimed The Wire deserving of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Walter Ben Michaels, in a lament about the failure of the American novel to tell stories that matter to the neoliberal present, called it the most serious and ambitious fictional narrative of the 21st century. In other words, the best novel never written. Sociologist William Julius Wilson argues that it is a fiction that is sociologically true, by which he means it captures the truth of his sociology. There is also showrunner David Simon himself, who has alternately claimed the work to be either a visual novel or a Greek tragedy. Much of this praise borrows a literary prestige that corresponds to the series' excellence, but not closely enough to its actual form, as Jason has shown. I've argued that before making these more exalted comparisons, we should bring the series back down to earth and see how it grew out of Simon's own journalism in the late 80s and 90s at the Baltimore Sun, then out of the conventional melodrama of crime genres and new forms of serial television. Of course, The Wire is exceptional, but its exceptionality derives from its roots in contemporary mass culture, seriality, televisuality, and melodrama. Oh, I should see how I'm sorry. Yeah, that does. In this brief talk, I want to emphasize melodrama along with seriality, and doing so, I am going against David Simon's own claim that it is Greek tragedy. When critics say a work is tragic, they mean to say it is exalted, great, like Sophocles or Shakespeare, But more often, what they really mean is that individual fates are sad and realistic, not that stories are fated catastrophes. They simply mean that the work is serious and good, implicitly better than a crowd-pleasing and facile melodrama. To invoke melodrama is to drag in a great many negative cliches: pounding, over-emphatic music, pathetic victims, leering villains, florid acting, and the triumph of virtue in badly motivated happy endings. All of these cliches seem to point to forms of excess measured against either more realistic or modern norms. The Wire is better than all of these cliches, so why do I insist on calling it melodrama? Most of the negative qualities by which we recognize melodrama are artifacts of the early 19th century when it first became popular, and then again in the early 20th century when it migrated from stage to film, as in this example from Birth of a Nation, and later to radio and television, this example from Roots. In film and television study, the resistance to understanding the importance of melodrama reflects the belief that something variously called classical realism or classical Hollywood long ago became the dominant form of acceptable filmic and televisual narrative, making melodrama seem archaic. To view melodrama as an archaic excess banned from the well-motivated and efficient classical tradition is wrong, I argue, in several ways. It ignores the inherent modernity of melodrama by consigning it to a frozen moment in history, the early period of its first emergence in high hyperbole on the 19th century French stage. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, okay, classical. It then views all further developments of melodrama as a shameful or comic atavism rather than as a continuing response to the changing conditions of modernity. It is to ignore, for example, the ways that newer media like film and television have reinvented it. Second, it is to assume, as does even melodrama's great contemporary rehabilitator, Peter Brooks, that by looking under the surface of the great works of realist literature, say Balzac or Dickens, we can discern the embedded remnants of an older melodrama. Thus, even among its rehabilitators, melodrama is regarded as a mode of excess. Back to that. I think we have to ask, more excessive than what? At the beginning of the 19th century, melodrama was excessive in relation to the decorum, unity, and efficiency of neoclassical tragedy and the Greek and Roman models that preceded it. This neoclassical tragedy held that characters must declaim their woes with no grand gestures, no startling tableau, in short, with no great Sturm und Drang. In relation to ancient or neoclassical tragedy, the new upstart melodrama was radically hyperbolic, the very model of bigger than life. Its comparatively grand gestures, inflated rhetoric, and unprecedented use of music was straining to name ineffables that could no longer be named due, Brooks believes, to the loss of a common ground for what might count as sacred. If the innovation of adding melos to drama once enhanced the emotional power of the melodramatic stage in contrast to the starkly silent tragic stage, this does not mean that the mere addition of music today to theater, film, or television automatically means melodrama, or that its absence means a contrasting realism. Rather, melodrama's conventions have changed. Indeed, as drama historian Matthew Buckley notes, melodrama and its music initially marked a new height of what could constitute drama, but of course that fell out of favor. And it declined. As early as 1830, it was considered passé. Not surprisingly, then, many writers who continued to do melodrama did not call it by name, including Charles Dickens. For the next century and a half, melodrama was viewed as a mere genre, worthy of notice only as the idiotic foil to modern drama's development of a new legitimate art. Many critics today still use the term to describe all forms of dramatic manipulation that go too far and which fail to respect certain rules of probability. Yet, if we are not to fix melodrama at some moment in the past, we must appreciate its protean qualities. Neither excessive music nor the facile defeat of evil by good is essential to melodrama. What is essential is the dramatic recognition of good and or evil, and in that recognition, at least the hope that justice might be done. And it is in this will to justice that I most recognize The Wire as serial melodrama. The pathos of the suffering victim turned righteous action hero is the curious, and I have to add, always suspect alchemy of much contemporary popular melodrama's cultural power. Just think of our contemporary blockbuster films, which begin with our heroes suffering or hanging by a thread, but usually end with our heroes suffering, usually end in the hero's slaughter of a great many, usually quite dark people. To suffer injury is, according to a certain Judeo-Christian framework, to be empowered. We see this in mass entertainment action melodramas as much as we see it in the stories we try to tell ourselves about our righteousness as a nation. Whether it is the oft-told American story of the conquest of the West, or those Indians just attacked the wagon trains, or the more recent story of the invasion of Iraq. In our popular melodramatic imagination, we either portray ourselves as suffering at the hands of villainous others, or, as has become more prevalent in the sad history of recent wars, we are forced to see ourselves as the villains. But as long as we see ourselves as victims, then we seem morally to deserve to be rescued or to conquer or to invade. That is, to occupy the position originally occupied by our injurer. Such is our deeply flawed melodramatic sense of justice. So in calling The Wire a melodrama, I don't want to say that it is not without flaws. But if we only look for melodrama in its most familiar and cliched aspects, these villains with mustaches, victims on railroad tracks, rescues that happen too late or in the nick of time, or long-suffering women, then we are likely to mistake its more subtle and contemporary forms. Melodrama can make itself up to date by annexing new and seemingly intractable social problems to the melodramatic end of recognizing individual virtue, or, as I argue in the more ambitious case of The Wire, recognizing a wider sense of justice and social good in the context of an ongoing abundance of worlds and sufficient time for change to occur. Melodrama is the dramatic convention through which timely social problems and controversies are addressed. It is not opposed to what we recognize as realism, and this is, I think, a key point. Rather, it enlists realism to generate outrage against realities that could and should be changed. Melodrama feeds upon the problem of these realities, the very injustice of them. To this extent, much melodrama can be allied with dreams of overcoming oppression. But if melodrama consistently wants to believe itself to be on the side of the oppressed, we have to realize that perceptions of oppression differ. Evil might be the oppression of slavery in one melodrama, excuse me. What have I done? Oh, well. Evil might be the oppression of slavery in one melodrama, but it can just as easily lie in the lust of an uppity former slave in another. Melodrama's commitment to justice is thus not in any way objectively or inherently just. An audience's ability to recognize good depends upon the manifest suffering of an oppressed innocence. Only through the sympathy extended to those who suffer can anything like Peter Brook's moral legibility occur. Melodrama's preoccupation with injury thus leads to what have been considered self-righteous forms of self-pity, or a phenomenon that I have simply called vying to be victim. This aspiration to the status of most victimized shows that a perverse form of power lies in victimhood. And this basically is what we're talking about when we're talking about playing the race card. One of the important questions I address in my book on The Wire is whether melodrama is condemned to repeat these patterns. Is melodrama itself the problem, as greater portions of the modern imagination have been given over to its influence? Or might it be possible to forge a less self-righteous kind of melodrama, one less dependent on wild swings between pathos and action, less a matter of cycles of victimization and retributive violence, and more a matter of reaching beyond personal good or evil to determine a better institutional justice? So while there are many problems with melodrama, most significantly this self-pitying identification with victimhood, I believe it is important to recognize that it is not a mere problem of the failure of inadequate or mediocre humans to play out tragedy. Melodrama is not failed tragedy. Tragedy and melodrama are distinct forms. Just as there are great tragedies, there are also great melodramas. And serial melodrama means that neither a single unhappy ending catastrophe nor a single happy ending need mark a conclusion, as I think Jason has just shown. Thus, it is through the greater abundance of world and time of today's serial television that it becomes possible to escape the evil or self-righteousness of individual persons. If my book on this serial has one single lesson, it is how The Wire grew out of a more limited, self-righteous brand of journalism. And I think if you look at Simon's journalism, there's a reason he didn't get a Pulitzer Prize. It's self-righteous. His voice is indignant and self-righteous, and it is white and middle class. The Wire has, so The Wire grew out of that into an inspired serial melodrama, where, as in the scene that Jason just showed, the important thing that is happening is all the things that David Simon would say in his op-ed kind of voice when he was at the Baltimore Sun gets said by different characters. So it's been considered so good, so realistic, so authentic, that it couldn't possibly be associated with something so contrived and lowly as melodrama. It has, of course, also been associated from television altogether, as in it's not TV, it's HBO. Yet, if most critics were unwilling to call the series melodrama, they often agreed to call it what David Simon regarded as the same thing, Dickensian, as we just saw there. Yet, even in its fifth and most blatantly Manichaean season, which I also prefer, and maybe it's just because it helps me work through my own ideas. It certainly isn't the best. The Wire shows us a way out of the impasse of the 19th century Dickensian melodrama by playing out the quest for moral legibility at both personal and the institutional level. In this way, it also corrects the Dickensian tendency to privilege the temporarily disadvantaged heroes who, like Oliver Twist or Esther Summerson, always turn out in the end to be well-born. It is thus a matter of great concern in The Wire whether the police can do more than merely catch bodies or make drug rips. or whether unions can avoid corruption, or whether city government can spend its limited resources in the right place, or whether schools can enable teachers to really teach, or whether media can report on the truth of what happens in the city. These procedural elements of the serial, modeled on police procedural, but extending centripetally centrifugally, as Jason said, to other institutions of the city, engineer a more contemporarily valid form of melodrama. When David Simon insists that The Wire is neither a cop show nor a crime show, he associates these obviously melodramatic genres with the overarching mode of melodrama as a battle between good and evil. We are bored with good and evil, he writes. We renounce the theme. I argue that he has not renounced it. He has raised it to a new level. Moreover, the stentorian voice in which Simon renounces a melodramatic division between good and evil is the same voice in which he once wrote his op-ed journalism on the failures of justice in the modern city. He spoke then in a royal we on behalf of society's victims, but that voice failed to be of those victims. This is the voice of yesterday's bad melodrama, speaking bombastically and self-righteously as a contemporary j'accuse. This is the voice that Simon fortunately lost when he learned to dramatize rather than editorialize on behalf of society's victims and against its villains in writing for serial television. He thus found a way to suppress the overt righteousness of his own archaic melodramatic voice to forge a better serial melodrama in its stead. Dramatizing both the necessity for and the difficulty of reform within each of the major institutions portrayed, The Wire's melodrama operates at both the personal and the institutional level. It is the meshing of the individual and the institutional that allows it to picture the political and social totality of what ails contemporary urban America and imagine what justice could be. The fact that in the end none of these institutions can recognize what is just and good in its own operation, despite the many individuals who try, is the basis of the series' famous anger and dissent. But such failures do not form the basis of individual tragedy. In the end, we find a city that remains in the grip of self-serving, short-sighted, careers police, ever more ruthless gangsters, a government that will always disappoint, schools where the best a teacher can do is control a class and encourage a kid or two, and a media that misses most of the important stories that the multi-sided ethnographic imaginary of The Wire tells. But the point of this melodrama is not simply to despise the villain and root for the good person, but to understand how the individual and the institutional mesh. In the often derided fifth season, we come away understanding that Marlowe Stanfield is a more perfected version of Stringer Bell. We see it in the coldness of his gaze, the single-minded devotion to the drug trade, and it is the institution that has made him. This institutional level of melodrama is the most bravura achievement of The Wire. It is the day-to-day workings of these institutions at the nitty-gritty level of budgets, drug profits, political horse trading, and editorial practices, all cross-cut for maximum interaction and comparison, not private loves, kindly uncles, or personal villains, that determines fate. So if we can agree that melodrama endures not only as an archaic holdover of 19th century stage play, or not only as women's films or chick flicks or Oprah confession, and not only in soap operas and disease of the week TV movies, and not only as the genre of family melodrama or blockbuster action, but as an evolving mode of storytelling crucial to the establishment of moral good or justice, then we might be able to see not only how melodrama endures in The Wire, but how it evolves towards the presentation of a higher sense of justice beyond the generation of mere pity. I think we tend to forgive melodrama for being melodramatic if it seems realistic and if its politics or sense of justice coincides with our own. We like melodramas in which the good we believe in is recognized. The innovation of The Wire is its effort to tell a melodramatic story at the level of the social institutions that have themselves repeatedly failed to serve justice. Seriality enables a new energy and means for the frustration of that justice. If the aspirations for liberal democracy are still valid in an era of neoliberalism, and if tragedy cannot stoop to care about the truly powerless, then a newly evolved serial melodrama proves to be the primary tool with which mass culture makes the case for some kind of justice. Melodrama needs to be part of our critical vocabulary, not only so we can complain about it when it is pat and predictable, but so we can appreciate it when it evolves into something new. The mode of melodrama continues to hold us in its grip, even when it is good.
No, I have. Sorry. Yes, it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Linda and Jason, and thanks Rob for organizing this, and Eileen, thank you for organizing this wonderful conference and inviting me. What I want to do here is talk about this little book. Oh no, this doesn't work like this, sorry. So, is there a clicker? Can I use this? Yeah, to talk about this book here. I published this in 2014, and Rob mentioned this, as an American studies person from outside the US, I'm mostly interested in The Wire as a narrative that produces American self-descriptions, and that does so within a specific media ecology in the early 21st century. So this book here, and I'm approaching The Wire not so much as a representation of certain aspects of social life in the United States in the 21st century, as if this was an ethnographic text that provides social data that happened to come in the form of fiction. So I'm not approaching The Wire as a window on American society, but as an actor within that society. And this actorship, this agency, then, however, includes the series' ethnographic and sociological ambitions and effects, which Linda has also written about, the ethnographic imaginary. So I'm asking, what is The Wire doing within American culture? Which other actors, which other actions does it set in motion? And there are two implications to this approach, at least. First, to look at The Wire as an actor, or an actor network, actually, means to take seriously its existence as a television text. And Jason, of course, has written a lot about this and talked about this right now. And in my first chapter, actually relying on Jason's work, I'm also trying to show how The Wire very deliberately situates itself on a changing institutional field of cable productions at the turn of the millennium or in the early 21st century, both regarding other HBO shows and regarding the larger field of changing television storytelling, what Jason has described as complex television. So I think this is the first important point to keep in mind here. The televisuality of The Wire is crucial. Secondly, to
To describe The Wire as a televisual actor or actor network means indeed that we do what Linda just did, and this is to take a look at it and to take seriously its seriality. And to look at its seriality means, among other things, means to see The Wire as a multi-authored and self-dynamic narrative that is always driven forward and actually changed by its own effects on audiences and the culture at large. Because I think that these 3 points really are defining features of serial storytelling. Serial narratives are narratives that evolve in a feedback loop with their own effects. An obvious example in the case of The Wire would be character development. Think of Omar, for example, because like many other characters in the show, Omar evolved in a serial fashion. So in the beginning, apparently, this character was not designed to be a major character, but then Omar developed into something unplanned, exactly because this character proved to be so interesting. So the fictional character itself, we can say, becomes a driving force of serial continuation, or more theoretically speaking, an important agent within that larger actor network that is The Wire. Another co-author, if you will, of this multi-authored text. Because once a strong character is invented, its narrative effects, its success, the pleasures and the profits that it brings to viewers and producers alike, all of this changes the trajectory of the series itself, setting it on a particular path while potentially sidelining others. And that's just one example of why we need to think about seriality when we want to understand what The Wire is doing within its culture. And I think at this point already we can see that some central features of this narrative are guided not only by its social vision, but also by the show's narrative requirements of serial reproduction. Now, concerning my subtitle here, The Wire and Some Sequels, since we have this feedback loop of production and reception, serial narratives always mobilize narrative practices beyond their original core texts. And that's actually what this book focuses on. It's about The Wire and its readers, more specifically, its US-American readers. And the argument here is that The Wire, as an agent of American self-descriptions and self-reflections, continues its narrative into other arenas of national discourse outside television, where various versions of The Wire, or unofficial sequels, if you will, circulate and compete. And again, since we're dealing with a serial text, this is not something that happens disconnected from the narrative. But the series itself, or the serial itself, like any serial narrative, is very sensitive to its own effects. So there's always a back and forth between the narrative itself and the follow-up communications that it sets in motion in blogs, newspaper articles, college classrooms, academic books, conferences like this one. For example, the volume Truth Be Told, which is a publication that's interestingly half merchandise, half journalism. This volume from 2010 features chapters in which the real-life inspirations for central characters in the Wire are compared not only with their fictional representations, but also with the actors who play these characters. And what the actors then have to say in interviews typically adds to, perhaps changes our understanding of the characters they're playing. Now, you may find this unremarkable because, of course, we're also used to actors interpreting their roles not only within but also outside of a media text. But think about what this means in terms of a narrative's cultural mobility. It means that these actors usually don't just execute some author's script, but that they can become co-authors, indeed, of a multi-authored and mobile text, a text that is not, finished once it is published. It also means that through such actions, the series itself pushes the boundaries of its narrative into ever wider fields of public communication until we reach a stage of distribution where everyone, from grad students to the President of the United States of America, can have their favorite fictional drug dealer and can benefit from the social knowledge and perhaps also the cultural credibility that is provided by this association. And again, let me stress that this is not some arbitrary effect of reception, but that the series itself actively seeks to provoke such scenes of recognition, especially when they center on questions of economic and racial identity as the two fields of as the two fields where the cultural work of The Wire is most pronounced, even without playing the race card in Linda's sense, because I think it is this exactly which allows actorship to be explicitly translated into activism at this point. As David Simon said, and I quote, "I want a homicide detective or a drug slinger or a longshoreman or a politician anywhere in America to sit up and say, 'Whoa, that's how my day is.' What I wanted was that longshoremen across America would watch The Wire and say, 'Cool, they know my world. I've never seen my world depicted on TV, and these guys got it.'" So realistic storytelling here is defined as storytelling that invites people not only to lose themselves in the narrative, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to find themselves there. Now, when we analyze US American receptions of The Wire, I think we can say that Simon pretty much got his wish. Because a standard rhetorical situation in writings on The Wire is indeed people finding themselves in the show. In fact, such scenes of recognition are an important part already of the marketing of the series. So when we look at the show's paratexts, at DVD specials or publications like this one, we find countless examples of real people talking about how real The Wire is to them. So in a way, the show's realism has its own narrative, which is folded back into its self-description on DVD specials and merchandising publications, but also in journalism and all the way to academic writings, where scholars will often perform closeness, personal closeness, to their favorite fictional gangsters when they reproduce their slang in the middle of critical analysis, or when they freely appropriate the sayings of Omar or Stringer Bell, as if they were old acquaintances, which, for all practical purposes, they are. And I think that's the important point here, because it's not like all these writers would confuse fact and fiction. They don't. Instead, we can say viewers really experience Omar, Stringer Bell, Bubbles, and so on as serial characters. That is, as parasocial friends who really are or can become parts of their everyday emotional or political reality, to the extent that for every one of us, everyday reality is made up of our specific technomedial connections. So when people interact with serial characters as if they were real people, or with actors as if they were characters, we shouldn't write this off as a narratological blunder, but I think what we witness here is an example of the productivity of serial television in terms of controversial American self-descriptions and self-reflections. What this means is that we can actually read the endorsements or the critiques of longshoremen or gang members or reporters as part of The Wire's cultural work. And we might even then, in the next step, want to think about how the larger genre of American crime television contributes to the self-understanding and indeed the labor practices of reporters, gang members, cops, and so on, rather than merely representing them. I've never seen my world depicted on TV, Simon ventriloquizes his ideal audience. When we turn this statement upside down, perhaps we put it on its feet. Seeing something on TV, it can become my world. And this may indeed be a key praxis of American television. You know, having a social identity means to watch oneself being represented in national storytelling media. I think that's why questions of narrative representation are by definition political in the United States, probably more so than in other media cultures. The artifice of television made it real for millions who'd never seen anything like it, says a writer for The Wire. And it's probably not a coincidence that this statement calls to mind the original meaning of the term television, viewing what is far away. Two final points about this. First, if all of this is so, then The Wire, as a narrative whose central writers and producers, and I use the term writers here in the classical sense of the term, the people who act the public role as authors, a narrative whose central writers are white, this narrative almost inevitably must be haunted by its authorial distance from the social world it depicts. And it is this anxiety almost, I would say, that perhaps more than anything else animates the show's mobilization of insider knowledge. You know, when the show ensures and signals, for example, through its casting policy and through the way that the casting policy has been publicized, that it signals that it knows what it's talking about, that its narrative ethos is indeed a journalistic and even an ethnographic one, constantly looking for and stressing its investment in local knowledge. But this must remain a tricky investment, or if you will, a serial one, as we can see in David Simon's interview with Nick Hornby, where he confessed that he was kind of afraid that, you know, someone even more knowing might come along and call it all a bluff. By all means to be avoided, according to Simon, was to come across as, quote, lamely white and unnuanced. So I think for some official authors and producers of the series, this is very much the question of confronting one's own white privilege, while at the same time trying to personally, certainly politically disassociate oneself from the effects of white privilege as a structural reality in the world, including the world of HBO cable productions. Because, of course, it's not a coincidence that this series is officially authored by mostly white writers and producers. Not exclusively, but mostly. So while The Wire is necessarily apprehensive of its standing within the social world it represents, because it always fears, and with good reason, that it might objectify its characters, it works hard not to. And not least by casting non-white actor activists, and in large numbers, as crucial contributors to its narrative network. And yet, all of this, of course, could not prevent that on the empirical field of actual receptions, we also, of course, find reactions like the one by Charles Dutton, who basically called the show all lamely white and unnuanced, quote, David Simon can visit and sit with as many black folks in the city as he wants to. They can pay the families to get the stories. They can listen and walk around with dope fiends. They can write about murders, and they still won't know a damn thing. And there's a lot more to this quote and a lot more to disentangle here, which I won't do now. But again, I think what is interesting is when you look at US American receptions of The Wire, particularly how professional writers have written about the show, especially academics, you find that on the one hand, these writings will often agree to the show's invitation to identify with its non-white or non-middle class characters. And in that sense, they continue the political work and also the emotional work of The Wire into scholarship, while at the same time, many of them are also, almost by necessity, acutely aware of their social or ethnic or economic remoteness from the world depicted in The Wire. And interestingly, in most writings that I looked at, this kind of distance is seen and treated as something that needs to be explained or excused or neutralized, for example, by establishing one's autobiographical credentials. So a common strategy, and I mean rhetorical strategy here, not something disingenuous, but a common rhetorical strategy is to explain how one's own social or economic background facilitates identification with the story world of The Wire. So there's a very pronounced confessional mode in a lot of these writings, and the writers will say, this is where I'm from, as in, I'm actually from Baltimore, or at least I have been to Baltimore, or my family background is working class. I'm a tenured professor now, but my family background is working class, or I have some other background or credentials that allow me to credibly tap into and talk about the social world depicted in The Wire. And I think you find this again and again in American writings on The Wire and not so much in non-American writings. In some cases, even self-consciously white writers can name themselves as such, so that self-consciousness about self-consciousness produces irony, as in Christian Lander's, not exactly scholarly, but obliquely critical inclusion of The Wire in his book, Stuff White People Like. So this is Christian Lander. Now, second and final point, getting back to The Wire as an agent of controversial American self-descriptions, rather than simply a representation of American society. Against the background of what I said about the representational politics of The Wire, and actorship turning into activism, and I think this dovetails nicely with what Linda just talked about how seriality enables a new form of melodrama. Against the background of all this, I think the series' most important accomplishment in this regard, in terms of representational politics, is as simple as it is powerful. Because the most important accomplishment of The Wire as a serial media text may well be how drastically it inverts entrenched routines of racial and economic representation in American television. So not only does The Wire feature a majority of African American characters, hence actors, but in doing so, it explicitly intervenes in some of the most routine habits of national popular storytelling. In more concrete terms, the series very directly and very visibly contravenes the standard practice of diversifying American ensemble casts, which would be to have one token representative of whichever group is thought of in need of representation. And as we all know, in some entertainment genres, this move can even be celebrated as a kind of breakthrough when it happens, as in the latest Star Wars film, where we finally have one visibly black main character, sort of main character, who, however, because of this singularity, is also singled out as a representative character within the larger sphere of cultural signification. Or in other words, that character then is loaded with the burden of cultural representation, which, if you think about it, is a rather heavy constraint on character design. So that perhaps the presence of such characters and the way that they act in their fictional worlds ultimately tells us more about how the producers want to be perceived in terms of their representational politics than about anything else in our world. My point here is we get none of this in The Wire, explicitly not. And this was absolutely, as far as I can tell, this was absolutely unusual on national TV at the time. And it is still unusual today, if not more so today. So not the singularity of ethnic representation is stressed here, nor some fantasy of colorblindness, but we have a narrative that puts African American characters, and poor characters, I might add, not only at the center of storytelling, but that arranges these characters over a wide spectrum of shifting or indeed serial moral properties, rather than, focusing on only one class in its racial representations, or rather than affirming middle-class values even when it depicts the urban poor, which I guess would be a standard way of representing poverty in Western entertainment. basically claiming that the poor live middle-class lives in disguise. And we don't find this in The Wire. So The Wire works hard to narrativize some structural links between economic and racial injustice, but not by portraying members of the underclass as pure victims, nor as pure objects of police work, nor by reducing them to singled out strong characters, to leadership characters that somehow serve to excuse the narrative's other representational choices, but by intervening directly into such storytelling conventions when the show represents and serializes marginalized characters as central subjects of ambiguous actions. So as a serial media text, as an actor in and on contemporary American television, The Wire is engaged in a decentering of whiteness, as Gibb and Sabin called it, and I would add a decentering of middle-classness at the level of media practice itself, which I would say is indeed unusual and almost unique in contemporary American entertainment. Thank you for your attention.
I think we have about 10 minutes of possible questions here. I understand that the practice is that we walk up to the microphones. There's one there and one there, and a line is forming, I see. Sure.
Wow, thanks so much for that. I'm kind of experiencing a bit of doctoral student anxiety because I think you all just collectively wrote one of my chapters. So the way I'm going to get over this is ask you to write even more of my chapter. And I'm going to do that by kind of piggybacking a little bit, Professor Kelleter, on your talk, and ask you a little bit about how, and also on the great panel we heard this morning, and ask you not about how, The Wire kind of plays this role of, through its form and its genre, of creating certain readerships or things like this, but rather of pedagogies, because I think it's really interesting, a lot of what we heard this morning, about the different approaches that are happening in classrooms. And I think there's been a little bit, actually quite a lot by you, about kind of scholarly discourses which have been written. But I think it's also an interesting take to kind of place that in terms of not just activism or scholarly discourse, but what's happening in classrooms. I mean, it's amazing, really, kind of what we saw. So I thought maybe you guys would like to speak a little bit about that, if it's helpful. Thanks.
Well, what is happening in classrooms? I think one of the speakers in the first panel talked about how The Wire allows its viewers to leave it as they came to it. In a way, this is true, I think, of any media text. But I would imagine that this is the big challenge of teaching The Wire, especially to American students, and especially in classrooms that are mostly filled with privileged or white students. Because there is, in any type of melodramatic representation, I think there's always, and you pointed this out, there's always the danger that it invites us to identify with the victims in such a way that we feel good about ourselves doing exactly that. Feeling good about watching The Wire, feeling good about reading these things, being socially aware, and so on and so on. And so this would, I think, trigger sort of a reaction that asks, oh, what can we do to help? Where the desirable reaction probably is to encourage students to see in how far their unacknowledged privilege is part of the problem, and that the desirable reaction to a TV show like The Wire and to the social world it depicts is to see how one is structurally involved in something that one might feel personally unaffected by. Because, color blindness is very much, I think, a white invention, because in order to be able to be colorblind, you have to be able to afford not thematizing race in your private life. So I think that will be, and that is probably the big challenge of teaching The Wire, making college students understand that this is not something, that this conversation is not about themselves. It's not about, do I feel good about this? But it's about acknowledging your own privilege. I don't know if this answers your question in any way, but it's. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, so I teach at Middlebury College, which is very much a site of privilege and elite. And I've taught a course on The Wire 3 times, and it has been a very powerful experience, and both narratively and in terms of its sociological discussions. But the constant tension that I just say very explicitly to my students is this poverty tourism? Is this what we're doing? Is we're sort of seeing a document of the other, where the vast majority of my students do not inhabit. And when I'm struck by in the clip I showed where Whiting dismisses Gus by saying, my wife volunteers in schools as a way to sort of assert his own knowledge. I feel like some of my students come away from my class saying, I did something about urban poverty. I watched The Wire. Mm-hmm. And the sense of that becomes an action. And at the same time, I do think that is something, because one of the things I love about Linda's work on The Wire is that having an emotional engagement with these characters and these issues and these institutions is powerful and it matters. So I don't think we can just dismiss the act of watching as simply not real. It is real. It is, yeah. But it also is not enough, obviously. So I think that's very much this tension that, and for me, pedagogically, I just talk about it, and I force my students to think about this and ask, how does this change you? How does this change your engagement, and where does it take you?
So much of the discourse around race in this country has to do with making people feel good about themselves. That that's what drew me to the Wire. Is here was clearly a melodrama, but here was a racial melodrama that was doing something different, and that was not making me want to pat myself on the back. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting, Frank, the way you show that Simon was acutely aware of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm also interested in the fact that Dutton, Charles Dutton, who is the MC in The Corner, yeah. One of the less successful Simon enterprises, I believe, and who is there in order to sort of reassure the white viewer and bring the white viewer into it, that Dutton should be the person who's so critical of The Wire. That's the problem when you start arguing about authenticity, and that's what Dutton was doing. I think we get on the wrong trap. These are stories. These are melodramas. They're designed to make us feel, but there's multiple ways of feeling and being involved.
And if I may add, and then I think your point about seriality is crucial here, because it is seriality that enables this multi-perspectivity. Once through its temporal dimension, which you have stressed, but also through the fact that these are multi-authored texts. So it's not David Simon's The Wire.
Certainly isn't.
But it is The Wire with a large network of contributors, among them activists and other interested parties. And I think this makes The Wire so powerful and probably so different from other racial melodramas in that sense.
I think we're almost at our time, but we have a couple of people who've been patiently waiting to ask questions. So maybe if we can quickly get through this.
Yeah, I'll be quick. One of the to me, seemed the most foregrounded sort of reflexive narrative or character tropes that came up was this Omar is sort of a cowboy. So I feel like all your sort of thoughts about construction of national consciousness, like the reflexivity, the idea of like a moral economy that's on an institutional level. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, sort of, which seemed like a more foregrounded, reflexive, like a little bit cheeky, sort of stylistically, foregrounded intertextual dimension of the show.
Did
Omar
you
as
say
cowboy.
cowboy? Oh, Omar as cowboy?
Omar cowboy, yeah.
Yeah, and definitely there are a number of moments where there's this sense of, Omar as a character is not embedded in any institution. And I think that's a key attribute, and one of the reasons why we love him in this narrative in which individuals are generally seen as well-meaning and institutions are seen as corrupt. Well, he's the one individual, maybe Bubbles. The two of them function outside of an institutional realm and actually flit between institutions, and thus are I don't want to say uncorrupted necessarily, but have differing degrees of agency in that. I think for Omar, he's the person who's above the institutions, and therefore that cowboy mentality is, he can do whatever he wants with no repercussions, except for, of course, the irony at the end of his demise. And the flip side is Bubbles beneath the institutions. He's the fallen soldiers that everyone's stepping on and is taken advantage of.
Yes, I'll be really brief. I'm struck by the phrase, the power of victimhood, and for the ways in which there are various structures of identification that mobilize our viewing experience of the television series. And I think that melodrama gives us a way into talking about the possibilities that the show might be transformative, especially for its victims of urban poverty, but also victims of a way of life that has been represented through social realism, but melodrama tells a different kind of story. So I just want to thank you for that. It's very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, maybe one last question.
I want to come in out of left field. Does the seriality of these shows, the fact that they're written by multiple authors over a long period of time, does it eat into the moral seriousness of the shows? The fact, I was quite shocked in The Wire that D'Angelo was eliminated when he was. I thought there was a huge amount of energy that had gone into him, and that maybe somebody lost interest in him. I went to a conference on The Sopranos 2 or 3 years ago, and I said to the assembled experts, I said, why did Melfi essentially drop out? Why did Melfi do something stupid at the end? Why was she eliminated? And they said to me, well, there were 2 writers, a man and woman team, who were very interested in intelligent women, and they left the show. So what I'm here to ask you is, despite the fact that there are showrunners, the moral seriousness that you, Linda Williams, have talked about, isn't it somewhat harmed by the seriality of these shows?
I think it's a good question. I think that melodrama and serial melodrama can always be whimsical, and you can kill a character. We know this from soap operas, but it's true. Dickens could kill off a character for a reason having to do with the narrative arc that he was engaged in. But Frank's point about melodrama is that it's sort of like a living thing, and you cannot talk about a single author who has the power. And so it's this collectivity of decisions. In that case, you can point to sexism, but on the whole, what melodrama does is something that used to happen a lot in the heyday of melodrama, and which we have reduced to a memory of soap opera, and which is not that. It is a much more serious possibility.
Yeah.
So we've got a kind of collective moral decisions that are being made.
Yeah, but most of us, our ideas about the morals of art didn't come from soap operas. Maybe not always from Oedipus Rex, but from works that had consistency, and where there was a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the guy, when he got to the end, or the girl, when they got to the end, could fix the beginning if they wanted to. There was consistency. As I said, there are, I'm not making a complaint in a way. My guess is that the seriality gives something that we didn't have before.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say that writing a compelling serial, or creating, not just writing, creating a compelling ongoing serial is much, much harder than creating something bound in that way, because, especially when we're talking about television, it's not just about the fact that you have to sustain this engine, but there are hundreds of other collaborators who may or may not participate at a given moment. So a character is, an actor is no longer available. They're,
No, I understand that.
And so I think that the idea that there is a singular moment of origination, and the writer writes it, it becomes a bound thing, and there it goes into the world. I think that's how we conceive of authorship, but I think that that's also limiting in a way. And I think of my own work as a author of scholarship. And it's not just like I have a thought, I write it down, I publish it, I'm done. It's all about this sort of ongoing conversation and reading other people's work and engaging in that way. I think that's what authorship is.
That's life. That's what you're talking about is life, not art. If somebody came in and wrote the middle of your piece, that would be more like The Wire. I mean, that would be more like seriality. It's easy to say that things that have a single author and have beginning, middle, and an end are like some sentimental thing from the past. But as I said, I think things are gained by having multiple authors. But I wonder, as I said, I was very surprised when D'Angelo was dumped.
That was not because, from what I've heard, that was not at all because of anyone losing interest or anything like that. It was to highlight the fact that people are expendable in this world. In the drug game, the fact that we love D'Angelo in the first season, the fact that we love Wallace so much, meant that their deaths would mean something in the moral liability.
And there's the level of repetition. So there will be other D'Angelos,
Yep.
and to see the multiplicity of it is a value. There is a beginning, there is an end, but it's a very long middle. We're talking about enormous middles.
I think we're going to have to wrap things up there, lest we eat too much into our eating time.
Yes.